Buenas tardes.
Good afternoon. On behalf of Ariel, thank you for being here with us this afternoon for Jenny Odell's book presentation. Thank you to Fundación Telefónica for hosting us here. It's quite cool. It's so hot outside in Madrid. Thank you very much, Nerea Pérez de las Heras, and thank you, Jenny, for coming here to tell us about your book. You'll remember Jenny for her previous book, How to Do Nothing, a provocative title for these lives that we have nowadays with so many obligations and running all the time. She was already defending the idea of human beings not needing to have so many obligations and so much timed activities. Her book is a manifest in favor of that thesis, but also about the need to reconquer our time. It's not something we can do with just little things in our lives, but it's something that must have public policies backing that up, social initiatives that will affect what we're doing, that will make us better and that will make us happier so we can control our time. But you're not here to waste your time listening to me, so let's reconquer our time listening to Nerea and Jenny. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thanks a lot to all of you. Thank you, Carmen, for that introduction. Jenny?
Today, I was going to carry out this presentation in English, which is harder for me. But after reading your book, I decided to be less productive. I decided to be more self-indulgent and to listen to the rhythms of my own creep time. We will speak about this. So, since we have an interpreter, I'll do this presentation in my mother tongue. I'll do this presentation in Spanish. Así que vamos a ello.
So let's move to Spanish then. So first, I want to introduce Jenny Odell. She's a multidisciplinary artist. She's a teacher in Stanford University. She lives in Oakland, California. Her family is from the Philippines. Her identity, her multiracial identity, is important to understand her book. She likes bird watching as an activity. This is also important to understand the way she sees the world. Jenny, you decide to write Saving Time, the original title of your book, in a moment that's not important just for you, but important for the humankind. What makes you talk about our experience of time?
I'm supposed to be using this already.
Yeah.
I didn't know. I thought that was just an intro. Okay. That's sorry. Okay. Let's see. So interesting. Yeah, okay.
So the question was that you decided to write this book in the pandemic, and why this specific time made you make a profound research in our use of time. Yeah. But keep it down.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, I mean, this topic is something that I had been thinking about for a long time, actually even before I wrote my first book, How to Do Nothing. So when I look back at my notes for that, actually, I see a lot of stuff about time that didn't quite make it into that book. And so I kind of, in some ways, like this book is the long lost twin of How to Do Nothing. But after I wrote How to Do Nothing, a lot of the feedback that I got from readers had to do with time. So time was like a really big obstacle for anyone who wanted to engage with like the practices that I was writing about. And I was just observing kind of like the time pressure that I felt and that everyone around me felt, and just that it was this general feeling. And that's kind of what I tend to work with, like in How to Do Nothing as well. I was kind of observing a lot of anxiety and people feeling bad about their use of social media, and that was my starting point. And so in this case, this kind of truism that like no one has any time and that everyone feels a crunch for time, and at the same time you're thinking about the climate clock and feeling like you're at the end of time, and that there's something very painful about living in the dissonance between this daily time crunch and this other painful feeling about not being able to imagine the future. It was just kind of in the ether. It was something that I was observing, and it seems like a book that would have been conceived during the pandemic because time got so weird. But I actually wrote the proposal right before the pandemic started, so it was written during the pandemic, but it was conceived of before.
But there's a pandemic atmosphere.
Oh, for sure.
Huh.
Yeah.
Nos hemos familiarizado. Do you hear? Nos hemos familiarizado.
We are familiarized with the idea that time is gold.
Nos hemos familiarizado con la idea de que el tiempo.
We are familiarized with the idea that time is gold, a treasure, and we have a different way of understanding time. Time for a pregnancy, for healing a wound. When and why does this become so important, the relation between money and time?
Okay. I think that, one of the things I was trying to explore in this book was time as a language, like the similarity of time to language. And obviously I've been thinking about that a lot here because I speak very little Spanish. But if you think about how, when you're at work, time is money. Like literally, you're selling your time for money. There are spreadsheets, your productivity is being logged. But then we also have these other languages for time that, although I think they're kind of threatened, we all still have some access to. So like, as you said, like time for, like healing, seasonal time, grief, like memory, all these kinds of different ways that time can feel and ways to talk about time that you can't really use the language of the clock for. They don't really fit into that. And so when I first conceived of this book, I was thinking about time as money, as an invasive species of time, because I think about ecology a lot. And so if you think about like industrial capitalist clock time evolving in a very particular set of circumstances in a particular place, and then being literally exported to colonies and other places, and like basically continuing to colonize more and more of life, like psychological life. I think thinking about it that way helps, to think about almost in a habitat restoration way, or like the work that people do to save languages. Like that's kind of the same way that I think about trying to that's what I mean by saving time in the book, is like saving other ways of experiencing and talking and conceiving of time.
Has mencionado que
You mentioned that the clock time is an imposition from the colonies, relatively recent, that arrives as a tool for domination. When is the clock? When do we begin to use the clock to measure productivity? When exactly?
So I kind of, when I was going, into historical research and trying to find that point, the beginning seems kind of fuzzy to me. There's like a lot of writing about time in monastic time in monasteries, like European monasteries that were actually highly productive economic enterprises where they have, like clock bells and lots of little other bells, like all dispersed throughout, and there's like a great emphasis on punctuality. And then that kind of getting picked up by towns that are commercializing, and sort of there's starting to be the need to buy and sell the labor hours of other people, which I think is like the key, right? Like that is the thing that makes this conception of time like a useful tool. And so one of the things that I found that was very disturbing to think about was there's a really great book called Accounting for Slavery by Caitlin Rosenthal about how some of the earliest things that we would call in English spreadsheets were used on plantations, so American and Caribbean plantations, to record like the labor days of slaves. And so like even the concept, right, of like a labor day or a labor hour, like that's again very specific to the need to make people do that kind of work, and also to try to get more work out of the same people in a shorter amount of time. So one of the things that Rosenthal points out is that it's those sheets, which they actually made pre-printed ones. So you as a plantation owner could buy a pre-printed log with these spreadsheets in them. They're not just about recording labor, they're about optimizing labor. The whole point of the book isn't just to record, it's to make the whole system more efficient so you can get more labor out of these people that you own. And so obviously you also see that in factories, early factory labor and Taylorism, but I found it very interesting that there's that earlier, much more kind of disturbing example.
Este seguimiento del trabajo esclavo que...
This tracking of slavery and that you tell us about in the book is very similar to our experience with the accounting of working hours. Right now, also during the industrialized era, getting as much work as possible in the minimum amount of time. That's still like that nowadays. And right now we even have some monitoring tools in our computers and workplaces. Do you think that this way of understanding time, which comes from a domination time that it's so horrible, impacted all the ways to understand time that we have in our life, and not only in work but in all the aspects in our life?
Yeah, I definitely think so, and I think you can ask any person who works, in an Amazon warehouse where the scanner gun is a timer. Like it's directing their motion, but it's also timing them. Or someone who works for, like a delivery service where the truck is full of sensors, that it's timing how long it's taking them to do their seatbelt and whether or not they're taking the most efficient route. Like, one of the things I mentioned in the book is that like Taylorism, Frederick Taylor, early 20th century kind of like factory labor innovations, like people associate that with like old factories, but Taylorism is alive and well. It's in all kinds of things, and I think a lot of people experience that maybe for the first time during the pandemic. If they were working from home, some people had employee tracking software installed on their computers, and so they're away from the boss or whatever, but they're still being very minutely monitored. And one of the things that I was concerned about, that in itself is a problem and it's very demoralizing, but there's also, I think, a risk of internalizing that domination aspect with yourself. And so, I talk in the book about productivity bros, which, as far as I know, I made up that term. But, like these typically men who have like these YouTube channels about how to dominate they always use that language, like dominate your morning. Like, you make this like power smoothie and you get up at like 3:54 and so there's like, you can see it in the rhetoric of that, this like that they have taken the same exact language that like a factory owner would use, like very aggressive language towards their employees, and they've just like they're applying it to themselves now. And that's an extreme example, but I do think that there's a real risk of doing that, particularly in a time when the solutions offered to people who don't have control over their time is typically to just get better at their own time management.
Hablas del tiempo como algo colectivo.
You speak about time as something collective. This kind of people or girls who do what productivity porn, how we refer to in the media, people who wake up early to do meditation or whatever, or mothers who apply those Taylorist rules, like if they had swallowed their own boss or they were their own police corpse within their mind, or they had someone there controlling what they do every second in their life. Can we get away from all these, or we are already dominated by these at all? You also compare these with Protestantism. You relate that?
Oh yeah. So I thought it was really interesting that when I interviewed the admin for a Facebook group for working mothers, I kind of suspected that she, like, I just kind of, my questions to her were kind of like, does commercial time management, self-help, like even work for you? Because I suspected that the answer is no, but I don't know that. But basically she said, yeah, like I feel insulted by time management books that tell me to just like, you know, be more efficient and like use my time better, because like I'm experiencing a structural problem, and like my life is not the same as someone who doesn't have children or isn't expected to like, you know, take on caretaking duties. And so I thought it was really, really interesting that her own kind of like reaction to that was thinking that she should get 6 other mothers together, and that every day of the week one of them would make dinner for everyone else, and that's already a movement in a collective direction. And that really gave me hope, because I don't know, I have a lot of faith in individual people, and sort of like I think people know when something isn't working for them, and maybe you can't always like put a name to it, or you don't always know how to get out of it, but I think that particularly in the case of like women whose time is very devalued in the workplace, outside the workplace, like you get them talking to each other, there's a lot of intuitive knowledge about why something like a time management self-help book would not work. And then you mentioned the Protestant work ethic, which you know, I grew up in near Silicon Valley, where the Protestant work ethic, which is a very old thing, is still also very alive and well. Like it's considered normal for a startup CEO to sleep under their desk at night, and you know, like overwork is kind of this like religion. It's like a very cultural thing, and so it's and I think that's interesting because that's almost entirely cultural in their case. Like they don't have to do that. There's just this kind of like valorization of overwork and not doing anything else, and just your entire life is just work.
Es horrible, claro.
That's awful. That's awful what you're telling us. And what we see in common from those productivity bros, that person, that CEO sleeping under his desk, or people writing about time management, what they share is that they understand time as something they own, something that it's only theirs. And reading your book, I realized, I already knew this, but I saw the explanation that's cheating us, that's fooling us, because time is something that's collective. Can you explain that? Where do we see the impact of that time that we're saving, that we're using better? How does it impact society?
I think, you know, it's very insidious. It's like kind of a dangerous idea, and it's very seductive for people who feel that they have no control to be told that they can take control, which is what those types of books are promising you. Like, oh, you don't have control over anything in your life? Well, you know, buy this book, and at least within your own little sort of like grid, like you can get things to be super efficient. And not only does that often, I think, not work, but on top of that, it obscures these other avenues, like, you know, getting the 7 women together and each of them make dinner, or larger things like union, or like, you know, or more informal things that aren't quite a union but are some kind of collective action. There's a danger that if everybody has these kind of blinders on, and it's just like, I am concerned with making my time as efficient as possible. Yeah, like my time that I own is kind of like I always think of it as like a box of like time cubes, you know, and you're hoarding them. Then like those kind of other actions that would actually change people's experience of time are not visible.
¿Y crees que el feminismo en principio?
And do you believe that feminism, at the beginning it was suggesting a human experience not so much related to that exchange between time of time for money. Then we get the feminism based on Shakira's song, for example, women bill for their services. Did that change the collective management of time in our days?
I don't know if I quite got the second part of that question. Sorry.
Ha perdido el feminismo. It's not revolutionary anymore. Since,
I see. Like lean-in
feminism.
Yeah, definitely. And I one of the things that I quoted in the book was Angela Davis in a book, I think from the 80s, says, you know, like childcare, I'm going to mess this up, like housework should be industrialized, childcare should be socialized, basically these things that are like household work should be made like collective and public and easily accessible to working class people, and like we're so far from that now, where now it's like girl boss, whatever, you can be the girl boss of your own life, and it's very empowering, but it's individually empowering, it's not collectively empowering. Yeah.
What do you think of ¿qué piensas del término?
What do you think of the term empowering?
I mean, I don't necessarily have a problem with it, but it's like empowering who, I guess. So if it's just empowering an individual, I mean, power is very unequally distributed. So if everyone was empowered, like that hasn't changed any of the distribution of power. But like collective empowerment, I find really interesting. And I do think that, I don't know. I mean, I think about examples like, we had the writer's strike, in Hollywood. And like there was, I don't know if anyone used the word empowerment, but I think that there was like an acknowledgement of surprise when people who were individually suffering, exploitation and horrible work practices and instability, when they, and I think a lot of them maybe hadn't been involved in, like union organizing that much before, and then they were so amazed at what they were able to get done as a group, and that was empowering. But that's a collective empowerment. So, and I think that like, when you see the word used like commercially, typically it means individual empowerment, yeah.
Hablas de citas a Britney Cooper.
You talk about quotes of Britney Cooper, among other philosophers and people in the academic world. And Cooper says that the owners of time are white people, white individuals. Can you give us specific examples of how we see this racial segregation in the management of time?
Oh yeah. Oh, Britney Cooper. Yeah. So yeah, Britney Cooper is an example of someone who she makes the statement in her talk that white people own time, which she obviously means as a provocation, but then it has kind of like multiple meanings, like on a literal level. Like if the feeling that time is money has to do with the fact that someone has bought your time, and the majority of people who are buying the time of other people are white, then that statement kind of just makes sense on the literal level. But I think it's also in a broader sense, if you think about what it means. If you think about how differently people's time is valued, right? Like one example that I always think of is like just as a thought experiment, whose clock are you on, and then who is on your clock? And then just thinking about those questions will kind of illuminate this structure and this hierarchy of some people are expected to either hurry up or slow down and wait for other people. And so there's like a whole infrastructure of that. And then you see this whole hierarchy, and you keep going up the hierarchy, and when you get to the very top, what you get is typically white, like idea men, like the people who are doing like the deep thinking, who need to not be disturbed because they're like busy making like innovations, and then meanwhile in the background there's all these like women and people of color like running around maintaining the temporality of like this small group of people. So that's kind of like how I think of that example, is just when you think about people's not number of hours, but just people's individual experiences of time as expressions of where they are in various social hierarchies and racial hierarchies. Like, it's pretty easy to see.
Yeah. ¿Y qué piensas de? Hay un momento.
And what do you think? There's a moment when you talk about automatization as something fake. In a way, like not everything that seems automated is actually automated. So you talk about these human filters of many of the videos that we see, for example. How do you think that this will affect automatization or artificial intelligence? How is it going to affect the way we understand and we manage our working time?
I don't know. It's like it's in this moment where I have no idea. I think that I have no idea what's going to happen in the future, but when I look at the past, I see like a pattern of, and I'm obviously not the only person to have said this, but when you look at the history of automation, for example, in workplaces, like it hasn't, it typically rearranges work. It's not that it makes work necessarily go away, and so like it might, for example, mean that in a certain place you aren't seeing that many workers anymore doing something, but maybe it means that they're all in the global south now, and they're all doing like a different type of task than before, but it's still not great quality of work, you know? And so I think like that's the lesson that I take from what we've seen so far, is that it's like, it's not in itself liberating, it's more like reorganizing the field of work. And I think the problem comes when people sort of uncritically think that it's going to somehow like liberate everyone from work instead of just change it. Yeah.
Sí, ¿y qué hay del...
And what about the time outside our working hours, leisure, our leisure time? Is that money as well?
So I think there is a risk of it seeming like money. I draw from a lot of personal experiences in this book, and one of them was working at an amusement park, like a theme park, basically kind of like Disneyland, but not as good, close to where I grew up as a teenager. And I think in part because of that experience, I was primed to think about this thing called the experience economy, which is like exactly what it sounds like. You pay for experiences. The economists who came up with the term experience economy wrote that long before Airbnb started offering experiences. So they would have loved that. But it's, this notion that the experience is a product. And I mean, there's really obvious examples, I guess, like an Instagram museum or something like that. But truly, like something like Instagram could turn anything into any experience into a product. It can turn any environment into a backdrop. That's like what's so powerful about it. And I think that with that comes the risk that, you're off the clock at work, but now you're seeing your leisure time also as a form of material that needs to be optimized by consuming the right experiences. And I don't doubt that experiences that people pay for can be very meaningful, but I do worry about the position of a consumer, because I think there's something about being a consumer where you're not necessarily, it's a stance towards the world, being a consumer, versus being like a participant or being something else where you're not kind of like choosing from a menu of things and then adding something to your life as a product.
Me gusta mucho cómo hablas de los espacios en el...
I like how you talk about spaces in your book. And I remembered during a travel to Indonesia, a visit to a volcano. It has some sulfur mines and a turquoise lake, and tourists are going up while the miners are on the other side working. There are tourists buying coffee to see the sunrise, but there are also people sleeping. And you show us that relation between time and space, the experience of work, and that leisure time for other people. That leisure of experiences, when you see everything that you have around you, it changes a lot. It changes you when you open your eye and you see, as a tourist, you see who's out there working, and they are not working for tourists, they are miners, right? Which is dangerous for their health. That's amazing, that part of the book. I don't know if you want to make any comments about that.
I don't remember how I came across that, but it was, I think, I was just kind of doing research into like travel influencers, kind of thinking about the experience economy. And I found this really strange video. Well, it's actually strange because it's not strange. It's quite sort of normal travel influencer video. And I'm like someone who very much enjoys like reading against the grain. Like you watch something once and then you watch it again and you see something that maybe wasn't necessarily intended. And so, it's this guy who, like an American guy who's super like I'm sorry, I think he's British, and he's like he's like a travel influencer. He's super enthusiastic to go to this volcano in Indonesia, and then but like in his video you see like he has to get up super early to go see the sunrise, but you see like another guy sleeping in the background who's clearly just a worker, and he's like sleeping like not in a real bed, like sort of in a restaurant, because he has to be on the schedule of all the tourists who are coming to see, you know, the sunrise. And then on his way down, I think he runs into these sulfur miners who are like doing probably one of the most dangerous mining jobs, that just, I mean, I think their life expectancy, it said, was like 50 years or something like that from just the fumes and the weight and all of that. And he has this like really strange interaction where he's just kind of like, he's like, hey, and he's kind of excited about them, and he's just like, yeah, like super strong, so cool, you know. And it's just like, I don't know, like they're like kind of part of the experience for him.
Claro.
But if it's almost like if you watch the video again from the other perspective, it's very surreal.
Sí, y es tan difícil también no hacer.
It's also so difficult not to be ridiculous when you're a tourist. Actually, I think we need to bear that in mind. Being ridiculous, not as an anecdote, but something moral, like really, like in this case with these sulfur miners. And I would also like you to share how you understand real leisure, the experience of leisure.
So I was really inspired by this notion of horizontal and vertical time by this philosopher, Joseph Pieper, who's a German Catholic philosopher. And so it obviously, because of his background, it has kind of like a religious like tinge to it. But I think that there's this, the thing that was very useful for me was that he is very adamant that little gaps of time in which you restore yourself for work are not leisure. They're not true leisure. That's like something else. Maybe you can call it like recuperation or something like that. And that's really important, because part of the experience economy and all these other things is like also offering experiences or feelings of like restoration, being restored to a state in which you can go back to work and be more productive. And for him, that's not leisure. That's all kind of playing out on this horizontal plane. And then the vertical time is like when you have an experience that completely invalidates the horizontal thing. And it could be like, in my experience, 2 minutes long, because it will feel like something else. And so like the example that I always think of is when I was working at Stanford, which because of where it's situated has so many birds, which is a good and bad thing because I'm obsessed with birds. And I would be like late for class, and I'm like carrying all my bags, and I'm like thinking about like all the stuff that I need to do. And then I would hear like a particular bird, and it might be a migratory bird, and it's the first one of the season. And I know that it, you know, came from Alaska, and I would see it, and I would just be like completely frozen, and I would forget everything I was just thinking about. And I would just be like on a different kind of scale of time that isn't just not horizontal time. It's like, you know, migratory time, like memory, like all the other times I've seen this bird, like, and also just like a feeling of almost like self-effacement or something like that. And then, you know, again, that could be only a few minutes long, and then it closes, and then you go back into horizontal time. But I think like those moments, I think, have the element of like an interruption. You feel that you've been interrupted. Your entire way of thinking about time, which is often transactional, goes away. Like the other times that I've had this experience are when you experience someone's generosity. Like when someone does something for you that's so generous that it completely like obliterates the idea of like, transaction. Like I give you something, but I want to get something back, and I'm only going to give you time if it's worth it. And like, but then sometimes you'll have this experience of being given some kind of gift, and it just makes all of that go away for a bit. So I think that's also related to vertical time.
Se pueden, es casi una.
It's almost like an epiphany, this moment you're describing when you see that migratory bird for the first time, or having an experience when you're just giving away your presence. There are ways how you can try to live your lives that way, right?
Yeah, and I think, it's important, like, I feel like there's a balance between the reality that, like, obviously this is a state of mind that is more accessible for someone in particular life circumstances, right? Like, it's pretty hard if you're running around, you have multiple jobs and kids and stuff like that. But I think it's also important not to deny the possibility of that to someone who is in that situation. Like, I think that my experiences of this have sometimes been very quotidian, like waiting for my socks to finish drying or something, or like just like walking to the store to get something. And I think that's also important to emphasize because, as I write, in the book, like mindfulness and slowness are very commodified at this point. And so there's like this notion that you have to be in a particular time and place and set of circumstances to have this kind of epiphany, and like maybe you should pay, to be in those circumstances. Whereas I think it's something actually much more kind of woven into the everyday, something much more closer to the personal. Yeah.
Solo puede tener.
We understand that we can only have the experience of time or decide what time is if we have some kind of agency. And only individuals have agency. How can our experience of time change knowing that animals, nature, these items also have agency?
Yeah, that's something that was maybe a silver lining of the pandemic in a strange way. Was it helps me understand the relationship between being in that, like trying as much as you can to cultivate that state of openness and attention to something, and that what inevitably appears is the life and the experience of other people, but also non-humans. And so, like there's kind of like a exercise that I do in the book where I choose like a specific branch on a specific tree that's in a park that I walked through almost every day. It's like near my apartment, and that the practice of doing that it sort of makes the tree come to life. If you think about like time lapse, like how like humans need to watch time lapse videos of plants to understand that they're alive and that they have like reactions to things. And so it's kind of this interesting back and forth because like, just paying that kind of attention brings you that awareness of the experience and the life of other things, which then changes your attention towards them, which then makes more of that appear to you. And I find that over time it really becomes like a conversation with like as if it were with a person, and you really develop a sense of the other entity having its own center of gravity, which was important for me in the book also because I think that that's missing from a lot of like sort of the rhetoric of like save the earth. Like in that phrase, like earth is often still seen as it's seen as vulnerable, but it's also not sort of seen as its own subject with its own experience. And so that's part of why, particularly in the middle of the book, I relied so much on American and Australian Indigenous scholarship because they have so much writing about the non-human subjecthood and how to be in some kind of relation to that.
Sí, de hecho la bibliografía del libro y la.
And about the sources for the book, all those thinkers that you mentioned outside of the white and Western mindset, it's quite refreshing, especially when you're talking about something where we have the feeling that there's nothing much more we can do and the time is over, which is the idea that we have all over in the book. Who finds this useful to think that really there's nothing more we can do? Is it really like that?
Yeah, I think the people who find it the most useful are fossil fuel companies, which I am very careful to say in the book. Because there's a really great book called Overheated by Kate Aronoff where she talks about like Chevron and Exxon and these companies in the 70s when they kind of are realizing what's going to happen, and they know about the climate science already, and they got really into scenario planning, which was like they would get these like wacky creative types to come up with future scenarios, like imagine a bunch of scenarios in order to find one in which like Chevron and Exxon still exist in the future, and that has so they're in the business of like selling an idea of the future and making it seem inevitable. So I remember being really surprised that the entire notion of an individual carbon footprint calculator, which is very widespread now. I don't remember which company it was. Oh, it was BP. It was BP who first like introduced the idea of an individual carbon footprint calculator. Not saying that that's like a not useful tool, but you can see how that is already pushing us in the direction of thinking about individual responsibility versus collective action, or versus a future where Chevron doesn't exist. So like, and it's almost like, it's like, I don't know what else to expect. Like they're a business, so it's like it's good business for them to pretend like this is the only option, but we don't have to do that. And so I was really trying to tease those apart, because I think there really is a feeling, it really has crept into everyone's minds that there aren't alternatives to that, and it's like, well, we just have to use it better instead of like, should we be using it at all?
Terminas con un capítulo.
You finish with a chapter which is very beautiful about death, but I don't want to finish with that before opening the floor for the public. But I want to focus on how you talk about creep time. Creep time is the time of disability, which is parallel to productivity time, which goes more slowly. And I've done that myself, and expropriating the time, stealing the time from companies. It's quite funny and quite refreshing how you deal with that. And we go to creep time, and that's a transition that has been quite enriching, quite happy, quite joyful. Do you think that anybody who's productive with skills has something to learn about creep time rhythms?
Yeah, absolutely. I was really inspired in that chapter by a friend of mine who wrote about crib time really beautifully, and she has a son with Down syndrome, and she talks about how he doesn't fit into the timeline of childhood development, so he's not hitting the milestones that you're expected to hit. He also is considered outside of time in a way because he's identified with his diagnosis. So, people don't see a child, they see a Down syndrome diagnosis. So he's kind of not afforded experience in that way. But then she sort of also talks about how, obviously that's very painful for her, but she also learns from him and from his own experience of what it's like to be outside of those timetables, and that there's a completely different way of thinking about like learning and joy and value, and like which are all things that he experiences, and so I thought it was really moving that she uses that as an opportunity to ask the question, I think she says, is the clock of industrial time built for bodies at all? And she doesn't say disabled bodies, she just says bodies. Mm-hmm. And she's talking about, not just people who would be identified as having disability, but like, someone who is happens to be in pain, someone who's pregnant, someone who's getting older, like the way you move through the world just changes as you move through your life, And so I think that's a really beautiful example of, something that is an idea from disability studies that is so applicable to everyone. Mm-hmm. And is also related to the idea of disability as not being, a thing that you have or a thing that you are, but that, everyone is going to experience different levels of ability throughout their entire lives. And ideally, we would be able to support each other as those variations happen, but that would require a very different way of thinking about time also.
Sí, en la manera de entender la discapacidad, como que todo.
Yes, actually, when it comes to disability, we all have some kind or some level of disability, or we will at some point. Now we have some time for questions for the audience. If you want to ask any questions, I have one over there.
Well, thank you very much. It was very, very interesting. And you've been speaking about time, of productivity, and all the time came to my mind the concept of boredom. How do you fit boredom in that productivity, in time, in experiences, because I really think that right now we are avoiding it at all costs. So how do you think about this fitting or how it is perceived? What's your opinion in this?
Yeah. So I feel like I use the word I would use the word boredom to describe something, and so almost like in defense of something that's like not quite boredom. So I think when I say I think boredom is endangered, I don't mean like actual boredom. I just mean what appears to be boredom, if that makes sense. So I feel like it's a very common daily experience that all of the kind of gaps in which you would be bored are taken up by your phone now, or like, if not your phone, maybe like thinking about something that you need to do, that kind of like every little gap of this like bored time. I'm using bored because I think like if you actually have those times, you might start in boredom, but in my experience at least, you end up somewhere else. You actually might end up being the opposite of bored. You'd be completely fascinated, and I remember one time I was doing this podcast interview where someone was telling me that when the iPhone came out, and like people were not familiar with it yet, his friend said, he's like, man, what if I told you that there's a device where you would never be bored? And he was talking about the iPhone, and he told me that, and I was like, I have a device where I'm never bored, and it's a jeweler's loupe, which is like a little magnifying lens that you can carry in your pocket. Like truly, you will never be bored. Like someone could be half an hour late to meet you, it's fine, because you're just, like every surface is so interesting. But like obviously those are different in a lot of ways, but one of them is that the phone is taking you somewhere else, and often involving anxiety, and this is taking you more to where you already are. And so anyway, so I guess, when I think that those places where what seems like boredom used to live are kind of disappearing, and I worry about it. Yeah.
Qué buena idea la de la lupa de José.
It's a good idea that magnifying lens. Sometimes they're very beautiful with their little pocket. So very, very good question about boredom. We have another one over there. I've been someone who's worked. I've had a very interesting work job that I loved. I was really passionate about it, but at some point you don't feel able to continue with that, and now I'm retired, and now my problem is, what am I going to do with my time? I keep surviving because I have many interests, but you get tired. I love reading, but I get tired of reading. I go to visit places, but I get tired of walking. So at some point, time becomes a problem.
That maybe I think some people also experience that during the pandemic, this experience of the opposite problem, where you have too much time or you're not sure what to do with the time, and it's kind of stretching out, and which was like such a different feeling from kind of like scrabbling for every little scrap of time that you can get. And I mean, it's almost like hard for me to imagine. But I do think, I recently started volunteering with like a habitat restoration group, and I thought ecological, I don't know, what is that in Spanish? Habitat restoration?
Sí, un centro de recuperación del hábitat.
Okay,
sí.
And it has the majority of people in it are retired, who are in the group, and I've been really inspired by just talking to them and hearing about, obviously that's part of what they do with their time, but I love hearing about all of the other things that they do, and it seems like it just took them a long time to kind of figure out like what are the things that they really love that are sustainable for them to do. But it's definitely, I think I suspect that it's something that people kind of don't consider until they find themselves at that point. And then suddenly you're faced with this question, and it takes a while.
y que lo que pasa es que estamos también...
And we're also used to using our time alone, right? You mentioned that reading, now you're here listening to this presentation. It's difficult to understand that maybe you can use your time with other people or get involved in something bigger than yourself, because we're not used to doing that, maybe.
Hi, I will ask you about the time distribution in terms of the dedicated time for work, because I have always been working internationally, and I have detected that certain countries offer more freedom and more free hours for leisure, for sports, whatever. So what is the point right now in the United States regarding this evolution about the participation both in your work and in your free time? Thank you.
I mean, my understanding is that the U.S. does surprisingly badly in pretty much all categories. So we have very little vacation time. Basically, you're at the mercy of your company. So like on the level, on like just a federal level, there's like almost nothing. And then so it just depends on if your company gives you, paid maternal leave, for example, or, enough vacation weeks or anything like that, which is that's another like kind of scarcity mindset thing that I think is like, people wanting to get into like the best companies to be able to have this thing that should just be like a basic right. And it's always very depressing when we Americans talk to like basically any people from any other country, especially Nordic countries, but like, European countries, Australia, where we're kind of like, oh, wow, like we have it pretty bad. And I think that's a really good example of a structural thing, that if everyone's busy reading time management stuff, like there's this thing happening over here that is really like affecting how much free time everyone has. And it's pretty arbitrary. Yeah.
¿Tenemos alguna más? Aquí hay una.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much. I can't wait to read the book. We both talked a lot about how time is transactional, because time structures our social dialogue, our language, everything. And I was wondering, what do you think about what happened to time with the big economic crisis? Like right after economic crisis, our feeling of time is more free, or maybe the other way around. It gives us more anxiety discovering that time is transactional, and that maybe we will get a huge crisis. I don't know what you think about this. If you could check what happened after big economic crisis and how people enjoy their time after those situations.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I mean, I can think of two things that are not quite like economic crisis, but like kind of related. And one is just the pandemic, right? I do feel like there was because death was so much on everyone's minds. It was like all around us. Like I had friends who lived in New York who like the ambulances are going past like all the time. And I think that definitely made people kind of more aware of their mortality, which is a different way of thinking about your time, right? Like that's like, oh, I have one life. I need to make sure that I am doing the things that are important to me rather than kind of keeping my head down, or, and I think that's like, obviously very upsetting, but important. The other thing that I think of, there's an amazing book by Rebecca Solnit called Paradise Built in Hell, which is about man-made and natural disasters, so like Hurricane Katrina, but also like the 1906 earthquake. And she interviews people who lived in the aftermath of those, and her book is kind of setting out to prove that people are not selfish in the wake of disaster. And so in the interviews, you hear people sort of say that in this interruption, sort of time felt very different, and maybe they met their neighbors for the first time and they felt like a sense of purpose in a way that they had never felt. And I also, I don't know if she ever quite says this, but I feel like there's also a sense of like participating in history, that like you're suddenly making contact with historical time, your lifetime in historical time. And oftentimes, like, I think what occasions that is very frightening, but also the people that she interviews often express like nostalgia later, because like that has kind of closed. And her question is, how can we invite that feeling without a disaster being the reason why?
¿Alguna más? Bueno.
Any other questions?
Yo quería preguntar.
I wanted to ask whether we really leave time or survive time, because, for example, in working contexts or more open contexts, we've been told to use time to be productive, but outside our work, nobody told us how to enjoy time. When we are out of our work, a lot of people go to a bar, they get drunk, or they do drugs, or we are also going back to that trend of going to gyms where you end up being a bigger exec, or I don't know. But really, I don't know if they are really enjoying their time or if they are healing some kind of problem with wasting their time, really.
Yeah, I think maybe in some ways that is related to that horizontal time, right? Like all the damage that is done by working, you then have to spend the rest of your time addressing in some way or like coping with, which is almost, it's not quite free time. I don't know, it's also, I mean, something that I ran into that I still is, it's still a difficulty, is like, you never quite know unless you directly talk to someone, like what they're experiencing. So like, for example, like I could observe that someone seems really alienated from life, but if they don't feel alienated or they don't say they feel alienated, then, so, or similarly, like if someone records their whole life in spreadsheets, that seems very depressing to me, but maybe it's very meaningful for them. I don't know. And so I think similarly with this, like it's probably a little bit hard to tell, like when is someone enjoying themselves at the bar versus, I don't know, I always think about when I was in grad school, everybody drank way too much because they were all super stressed out, and that was just like their only way of coping with it, and it was pretty clear. Yeah.
Bueno, pues cerramos aquí.
Well, we'll wrap up now.
For writing such a beautiful and fascinating book. Os lo recomiendo muchísimo, es maravilloso.
I really recommend this book to you all. Thank you for listening and for being here with us this afternoon.
Thank you.